the Klan and other hate groups have been doing ever since, which is elimination or incarceration. But before we talk about the 13th Amendment, so I have to go back a little bit and talk about the U.S. Constitution, why the 13th Amendment was necessary. So first of all, the U.S. Constitution, when it was written at a time in late 1700s, 1781, I believe. The U.S. Constitution, though it protected some freedoms, it also protected slavery. So in other words, the U.S. Constitution, I think in about the fifth line, if you read the U.S. Constitution, round about the fifth line, it talks about 3/5 of a human. That was directed towards those who were enslaved at the time. Those who were freed from slavery were fully human, but still second-class citizens, still treated as second-class citizens. So the U.S. Constitution protected slavery in that those who were enslaved, and it was about 790,000 at the time, those who were enslaved were counted as 3/5 of a human, not fully human. It protected slavery in that the slave trade, not slavery, but the slave trade would not end for another 20 years. So not until 1808, not until January the 1st, 1808, would the slave trade end. So that meant that or what we called old money, what they were doing was raising their wealth off of the slave trade, could still do it legally for another 20 years. Families are still living off of that money. They're living off of they're not even, haven't even really even touched the principal. They're living off of the interest from that money that was earned back in the late 1600s through 1808. So the slave trade was still legal. They could legally call out the national military to return people who had escaped slavery. There were several states, there were several colonies, all of the colonies started off with slave labor. After the American Revolution, the northern colonies, now the northern states, began getting rid of slavery slowly. And but it was legal for the federal government to go into those northern states and territories and return people back to slavery who had escaped slavery from the South. They would use the national military to do that. And then, of course, there is the representation in the Electoral College, where those representatives in states that had a small white population, their representation in Congress would be increased based upon those human beings who were counted as 3/5 of the human. So that is why when you hear politicians, and you will hear them now, when you hear politicians talking about we need to get back to the spirit of the Constitution, you need to say, oh, hold up, what parts? What parts are we going to get back to? Because the U.S. Constitution protected slavery. Now, you get to the first 10 amendments, which have the freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. But there's also, right before you get to those 10 amendments, there's something that says that whatever is not covered in the U.S. Constitution, it becomes a state's right. So when you hear people talking about getting back to states' rights, you have to say, okay, which parts of states' rights do you want to get back to? Because what was not covered in the U.S. Constitution then became something that would be in the state constitutions and then in local constitutions. So that is why you have to listen very carefully to what people are saying. Because though we have the 10 Amendments, which covers freedom of speech, freedom of religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you then had states that would come in and say, okay, we still have to control a part of the population. And what they would come up with, even in this state, Ohio was always a part of the Northwest Territories and a free state when it became a state in 1803. But Ohio wrote something called the Ohio Black Codes. And within the Ohio Black Codes, people who were coming into the state had to prove their freedom. They had to have freedom papers. If they didn't have freedom papers, they had to have 2 white individuals declare them to be of good character. And then they also had to pay a $500 bond per person. So if you're coming into Ohio from someplace south where your family for generations had worked but never had been paid, and then you're coming into Ohio with a family of 10, that's $5,000, 1803, which meant that did not happen. There were people who were here basically illegally because they could not come up with the $500 bond. And there were also instances in each of our cities. I know that there are people who have come from Springfield and Xenia and Columbus and Dayton. There are instances in our cities in which our city government, even though this was a free state, there were people who were incarcerated in that building right there. And slavery still being legal via the Constitution, there were people who would come into the state to be returned to them, and they were. Right, and there's a case that I know about right in this building, at least one case in which some people were incarcerated in the basement of that building and then allowed to go back into slavery. So the states would then have their black codes or their slave codes. One of the slave codes that was in place before the end of the Civil War was always assume that a black person is a slave until proven otherwise. So today we have always assume that a black person is guilty of something until proven otherwise. And unfortunately what is happening is that people are being shot and killed before and some of them even have their hands up, and they're being shot and killed. So we have our police officers, some of them, not all of them, some of them acting as judge, jury, and executioner because they're assuming that if you are running away, you did something wrong. If you're driving away, you did something wrong. If you're in a all-white community, you shouldn't be there. You might live there. You might be trying to get home. But the assumption is if you're there, you're doing something wrong. So then we get to the American Revolution was actually the first Civil War because it should have been where everybody was freed. So all of the things they wrote in the Constitution should have been applied to everyone, but they were not. Which is why we then have to have the Civil War. The Civil War was necessary. Got into an argument with one of my classmates when I was a student over at Wright State, who said that the Civil War was not a necessary war. And I asked her, well, why did she say that? And she said, the Industrial Revolution was coming in at the time, and it was becoming less and less, and slavery was becoming less and less of an issue. So had both sides simply waited, slavery would have been over around 1900. So that instead of us being 4 or 5 generations removed from slavery, we would only be 1 or 2 generations removed from slavery. One of the quotes that Reverend McCoy likes to use a lot is from Martin Luther King, who says that injustice is allowed to flourish when good people do nothing. So we have to stand up and we have to say, first of all, everything that is in, well, not everything, but the rights that are talked about in the U.S. Constitution, we want to apply to every American. We do not want to be judged guilty until proven innocent. We want innocence until proven guilty. And we have to be able to say to our police officers, we want protection too. Thank you.
Wiggle around, try to warm up since it's cold out here. My name is Joy Schwab. I'm with the Dayton Women's Rights Alliance. I'm going to speak to you about women incarcerated and the mass criminalization of women. First, I just want to give an overview of women in the prison system, then talk about how every woman is a potential criminal in our society today, and then talk a little bit about the Dayton Correctional Institute and its mistreatment of the women prisoners there. Unfortunately, I'm not as well prepared and knowledgeable as our former speaker. I'm just new to learning about all of these things. I'm going to have to look at some notes, but I do have handouts too. But first, on the incarceration of women, the number of women in prison has increased drastically, 646% between 1980 and 2010, rising from over 15,000 to over 112,000. There are 1 million women who are under the supervision of the criminal justice system now in this country. That includes women in prisons, jails, on probation, and parole. And of course, the women who are most subject to that are Black and Hispanic women. In the likelihood during the life of imprisonment for women. Oh, okay. Let's see. The lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for women is 1 in 56. However, the chances of a woman being sent to prison varies by race. As of 21, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment